AI is really good at writing code, right? Well, the thing is, AI is trained mostly on open source examples. And the problem is that open source examples tend to not be complete. They tend not to be prepared for challenges of a real-world application. In this video, I'm going to show you 13 principles that you can apply immediately to make your backend stand out, get a salary raise, and not get replaced by AI. Tip number 1. Think about what services your backend is going to need. For me, it almost always happens to be a database. Here I usually use Postgres. For files, I recommend using a bucket, for example, Google Cloud Storage, S3, or Azure Blobs. Of course, you can just use the file system, but be aware of the challenges it brings when deploying in Docker. With this approach, you're going to have to bind Docker volumes to make sure it's persistent, take care of backups on your own, and so on. If you want to go down this path, fine, but just make sure you're aware of these challenges. Tip number 2, create a .env file and git ignore it immediately. All the API keys, URLs, and settings will be stored here and nowhere else. Make sure your application loads these variables at start. Tip number 3. Create a .env.example file with the documentation of your .env file. Just put all the variables here without values, with some comments when needed. Tip number 4. Create a docker-compose.yaml file with all the services required to run your backend, or at least as many as you can run on your machine. This is going to be solely for development purposes, so a new developer joining the project, or even you in a year, can understand what services your application depends on by just taking a look into docker-compose.yaml. You can then start your environment by running docker-compose app-d, and if you bind the ports properly, your application can then access the services on localhost at the corresponding port. Tip number 5. For God's sake, wherever you deploy your application, make sure it can talk to the database over a private network. This makes the data exchange between them a lot faster and more secure. Tip number 6. Make sure you Dockerize your application by creating a Docker file so it can be deployed easily anywhere. Docker file is also a great help for developers getting started with your application because it shows what system dependencies your application has and how to set up an environment for it. Tip number 7. In real-world applications, database schema changes quite often. For example, when you develop a new feature and come up with a new column that you need, or maybe you might want to convert one data type to another to optimize something, or you may want to introduce a completely new table. That's where database migrations come into play. No matter what framework you're using, make sure you have a separate directory with your migrations, one migration per file, preferably one change per migration. For example, in one of my Nest.js apps, it looks like this. I think pretty much all frameworks have a concept of migrations. Make sure you use it. I also highly recommend to run your migrations on every deployment to ensure that the database schema is always what you expect it to be. Tip number 8. Split your app into layers, at least into the following: controllers, services, persistence. Ideally, the services layer should have no clue about what kind of database you're using, and the controllers layer should have no clue about how your services are implemented. If your application is a really small microservice, you may want to throw away the services layer. Do not abstract your code just for the sake of abstraction. But when you use a third-party service, say OpenAI, I strongly recommend abstracting it and using an interface. So let's say you write your business logic. It should have no clue about what OpenAI is. Instead, create an interface, call it LLM, with the predict method, taking a string as a parameter, returning a string or an error, and use it in your business logic. Implement this interface for OpenAI and inject it at start. Tip number 9. In the controllers layer, please use DTOs, or data transfer objects, for input and output data. Make sure your input data is always validated. All frameworks I worked with have this capability. Make sure you use it. Tip number 10. Test your code. Write unit tests for your functions. Write integration tests to test different modules or services with one another. Write end-to-end tests to test how API requests are processed by your application. I strongly recommend using test containers for that because it helps you create a test environment right inside your test code. Tip number 11. I strongly recommend setting up your backend in such a way that it automatically generates a Swagger documentation, which in turn you can use to automatically build the communication layer for your frontend code. It's just incredibly convenient. When working with Go, I use Huma. And when working with Nest.js, I use this Nest.js package built exactly for that. Tip number 12. Instead of relying on third-party services, for once build your own Auth with JSON Web Token, or JWT. It will boost your dev skills, give you more control. You won't have to share your user data with third-party services, and you won't have to pay extra money. And last but not least, tip 13, learn a few design patterns. There are lots of design patterns, not all of them are equally important for backend dev. My favorite ones that I really constantly use are dependency injection to inject the right implementations for interfaces at start, adapter, especially important when working with third-party APIs or SDKs, decorator, for example, for middleware in the controllers layer, strategy pattern, I use this a lot in combination with dependency injection, and finally the facade design pattern if you want to hide the complexity of your implementation behind a simple interface, which you should. That's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have any other tips, let's discuss them in the comments. Cheers!